When Disney introduced Anastasia and Drizella, they were just as wicked as their mother, Lady Tremaine, or at least that's what it seemed like at first. After watching all of the Cinderella sequels, it seemed like their characters were receiving more and more depth, and that only continued to deepen when Serena Valentino released her book Cold Hearted. This delved into the origin story of Cinderella's sinister stepmother, and not only did it give fans insight into what turned Lady Tremaine into such a villain, but it also revealed the truth about Drizella and Anastasia's childhood in a very heartbreaking way. Though many stories in the magical world of Disney end with a happily ever after, hardly any begin with one, and if they do, it's usually only happy on the surface level, which might have been the case for Cinderella's stepsisters. While the first Cinderella took place after Anastasia and Drizella's mother married the titular character's father, Cold Hearted by Serena Valentino was set a bit earlier in time, at least for the most part. You see, the book actually opens up after the events of the movie when Cinderella had already married the prince. It starts out with her fairy godmother receiving a plea from Cinderella to help save her stepsisters from the wrath of Lady Tremaine, who by that point had gone completely mad. But that wasn't the only time that Drizella and Anastasia suffered in their life, and Serena's book made that more than clear. After she received the letter asking for help, the fairy godmother was originally reluctant, but then was urged by the other fairies to read the full recorded history of Lady Tremaine and her children. And at that point in Serena's novel, readers finally got to see the bigger picture and officially find out more about Anastasia and Drizella's childhood. Long before they ever met Cinderella, or even moved into the fairy tale world, the two sisters were part of a happy family that lived in London as a part of the real world where most people didn't believe in the magical kingdoms. But despite that, in the book, Valentino certainly made it seem like their family, which included Lady Tremaine, her husband, Anastasia and Drizella, had a magical life together while it lasted. Their happiness wasn't meant to last forever though, and sadly the two young children would have to learn about loss and tragedy at a very young age, and it was something that would affect the outcome of their entire lives. Sadly, all life must come to an end at some point, and some people learn that lesson sooner than others, but not everyone has it uproot their lives to the extent that Anastasia and Drizella faced. It was fairly early on in Cold Hearted when the two sisters lost their father to an illness, and by that time they were still very young girls who hadn't even turned 10 years old yet. According to the book, Lady Tremaine spent the next 6 years of her life grieving and taking care of her two children, who likely spent a lot of that time watching her and seeing how she was handling such great pain. Sadly, even though she didn't realize it, the book made it seem like Lady Tremaine was only looking out for her own happiness when she took the next step in her life rather than thinking about Anastasia and Drizella, and that ultimately led the two sisters to experience more pain and heartache, the likes of which they probably couldn't even imagine at their young ages. As mentioned before, it wasn't until 6 years after their father's death that Drizella and her sister saw their mother start to fall in love again. This was depicted in Cold Hearted when Lady Tremaine went to a house party in London that was hosted by a friend of hers. It was there that she met a man named Sir Richard, who proclaimed to be from a land in the books known as the Many Kingdoms. It was a fairy tale world, and since Drizella and Anastasia were still so young, they likely jumped at the opportunity to visit the kingdom. Only, in this case, their visit would be a permanent one. You see, in the book, Lady Tremaine surprisingly found herself falling madly in love with Sir Richard, and within 2 days of meeting him, she agreed to his proposal of marriage. And just like that, Anastasia and Drizella had their entire lives uprooted as they moved from their childhood home in London to the Many Kingdoms to live with their new stepfather. And even though their mother didn't intend for it to happen, she ended up leading her daughters into a life that was filled with even more pain and heartbreak. This was mainly because, according to Valentino's novel, Sir Richard wasn't the type of person that he was pretending to be. Instead of marrying their mother because he loved her, Anastasia and Drizella quickly realized that they all had only been brought into Richard's home to act as servants, not as family members. On top of that, Valentino pointed out in her book that Anastasia and Drizella came from a wealthy family in London, but that wealth was something that they wouldn't get to see throughout their childhood, and that's because Sir Richard, their new stepfather, had claimed every bit of it to fund himself and to pay off any debts that he had accrued. By that point, Anastasia and Drizella were still very young, but had faced enough heartbreak to make even a full-grown adult want to call it quits. But sadly, that wasn't the last of the painful events and traumatizing situations that the two sisters would be put in throughout their lives. At one point, Anastasia and Drizella couldn't even look to their mother to protect them from the pain, since she slowly became the one who was causing it. It was mentioned in both the beginning and toward the end of Cold Hearted that Lady Tremaine had grown so irritable and unstable following the marriage of Cinderella and the prince that she became deranged. Cinderella had apparently discovered that her stepmother was beginning to hurt Anastasia and Drizella both mentally and physically. Actually, this was also sort of shown throughout the animated sequels of the first Cinderella movie. Lady Tremaine was very open about her disgust with Anastasia and Drizella throughout both of those movies, particularly when Anastasia began to fall in love with someone who was in a lower social class class. But in Valentino's book, it's far worse than that, and it's clear that Drizella and Anastasia's lives were nowhere near being free from pain. It's explained that the two sisters were more afraid than they had ever been now that they were suffering attacks from their own mother, while at the same time being trapped in an unfamiliar world that they had no way of getting out of. And at the end of the day, that's what started the entire book in the first place. The amount of pain and anguish that Anastasia and Drizella were feeling was so noticeable that even Cinderella, the stepsister whom they tormented, wanted to help them. But in Cold Hearted, that was easier said than done, and Cinderella had to practically beg Fairy Godmother to help them because she couldn't do it herself after the fairies placed an enchantment on Lady Tremaine and her daughters, preventing them from contacting or being near Cinderella. And whether you believe it or not, even that separation was likely traumatic for Anastasia and Drizella because they were cut off from the only person that they actually knew who grew up in the many kingdoms, the world that was still foreign to them. It really seems like the more you look, everything that happened in the two sisters' lives all stemmed from the heartbreaking loss and changes that they faced during their childhood. Interestingly enough, though, you could say that the heartbreaking childhood that Drizella and Anastasia shared had two drastically different effects on the children and shaped them into two totally different characters by the time the third Cinderella movie took place. You see, following the events of Cinderella, according to the animated sequel Dreams Come True, Anastasia, while still being a bit like she was in the first movie, leaned deeper into the fact that she was a romantic at heart. There was actually an entire segment in the movie that was based around her falling in love with a lower-class baker, something that her mother greatly disapproved of, despite the fact that she once knew true love for herself, at least according to Valentino. Throughout the rest of the movie, Anastasia was shown reconciling with Cinderella, who was the only one who encouraged her to follow her heart, and their bond grew even more throughout the third animated movie, Cinderella 3: A Twist in Time, where, once again, Anastasia was shown wanting true love, but not at the expense of others, which was true character growth, something that she might not have had if she didn't have such a heartbreaking childhood. That's not to say that all the grief she went through was a good thing, but it taught her to seek out true happiness. On top of that, it also would have given Anastasia insight into what it felt like to be hurt, both physically and mentally, which allowed her to sympathize with what she had put her stepsister through. That being said, grief and trauma can affect people in vastly different ways, which can be seen in how different Drizella ended up being when compared to Anastasia. While her younger sister might have learned from all of the heartbreak that they faced, Drizella's life and personality began to mirror their mother's as she became cold-hearted. Unlike Anastasia, Drizella never made amends with Cinderella throughout the sequel films, and instead she continued to act as an antagonist under the guidance of Lady Tremaine. Drizella was sadly warped into a cruel person by all of the heartbreak that she had to face growing up, and that was simply because that was how her role model learned to deal with her problems. Throughout Serena Valentino's novel, Drizella watched her mother, who she knew was a strong-willed person, turn into a cruel and cold tyrant in order to protect herself from the pain, and that's likely what Drizella thought she had to do too. After hearing what Anastasia and Drizella went through in their lives, do you feel sorry for them at all, or were their cold-hearted actions still inexcusable? Let us know what you think in the comments below.